The prince's story didn't begin with Mercury, it began with rot. By the late 1700s, the once mighty Habsburg Empire was decaying from within. Its courts were bloated, its power fractured, and its bloodlines were quite literally collapsing. Generations of inbreeding had produced a chain of rulers increasingly riddled with disease, madness, and deformity. The empire's might was slowly giving way to mirrors, shadows, and secrets. And then came him, born into velvet, marble, and duty. The Habsburg prince was not a symbol of hope but of worry. From infancy he was delicate, he convulsed often, his skin bruised easily, he struggled to speak and sometimes to breathe. He was kept indoors most of his life, swaddled not just in blankets but in whispers. Behind thick drapes and locked doors, a prophecy formed in private circles. The prince would not live to see adulthood, but he did. And perhaps that was the problem. His survival became a private obsession. Tutors were dismissed, priests replaced with healers. Even as a child, he was drawn to texts far beyond his comprehension. He read books on ancient medicine, alchemy, and resurrection. He was often found reading in silence while the court dined and danced. What the empire saw as weakness, he viewed as resistance. Each heartbeat to him was an act of defiance. Each breath, a protest against death's schedule. And he wanted more. As his teenage years arrived, his body remained fragile, but his mind grew sharper and hungrier. He began collecting relics, speaking to outsiders, gathering writings that had been banned from the imperial library for centuries. It wasn't enough to survive anymore. He wanted to evolve. In his personal notes, he wrote of the body as a soft machine, one that could be refined, purified, perfected. And then he read about Mercury, a strange, glistening liquid that glowed like silver fire. He believed he had found his key, but what he couldn't foresee was what the key would open. To the world, Mercury was poison, but to the prince, it shimmered with possibility. The moment he saw it, liquid silver that moved like a living metal. Something in him shifted. It was beautiful, unnatural, untouchable. And yet, he believed it could become the very thing that had eluded his empire and his body for generations: immortality. Ancient texts whispered its names: quicksilver, hydragyrum, the blood of the earth. In Chinese alchemy, it was said to restore life. In European lore, it flowed in the veins of gods. The prince's private collection of occult manuscripts referenced it again and again, often paired with other sacred elements: gold, sulfur, salt. Mercury, they claimed, was the gateway to purification, not merely of the body, but of the soul, and he wanted to be pure, untouchable, eternal. The imperial physicians were forbidden from speaking on the matter. Instead, the prince surrounded himself with outsiders, wandering apothecaries, failed alchemists, excommunicated monks, men whose names had been scrubbed from formal records, but whose ideas lived on in whispers and ink. Some were charlatans, others were genuinely brilliant, all were desperate. Together they worked in hidden corners of the palace beneath candlelight and closed shutters. The prince converted an old wine cellar into his private laboratorium. There, he gathered scales, flasks, scrolls, and metal instruments. Animals were brought in, then disposed of quietly. He began testing combinations of metals, herbs, blood, and mercury on rats and birds. He kept detailed journals, entries written in Latin, Greek, and his own invented ciphers. Pages were stained with dark oils and burned at the edges from misfires. He documented the changes: fur discoloration, altered behavior, lifespans slightly extended or shortened. He was unbothered by the failures. They were, in his mind, signs that he was approaching something new. At night, he practiced rituals meant to align the soul with the element. He fasted. He inhaled mercury vapor mixed with clove oil. He carved sigils into the walls, spirals, triangles, and suns wrapped in serpents. Sometimes he would sit cross-legged on the stone floor for hours, meditating beside an open vial. The court noticed the change. His skin turned paler, his eyes sharper. He no longer spoke at dinners, choosing instead to scribble on scraps of cloth or mutter calculations under his breath. When confronted, he simply replied, "You don't understand. This body is just the shell." But it wasn't enough to test the theory. He had to try it, to consume it. And so one evening, without ceremony, without witnesses, the prince brought the flask to his lips. The first drop was bitter, metallic, cold, and from that moment on, he was never the same. The first drop of mercury slid down his throat like ice forged from silver. It stung, then numbed, then settled somewhere deep inside his chest. The prince stood still, waiting, half in fear, half in awe. And then, nothing. Not at first. He coughed once, wiped his mouth, and looked at the mirror across the chamber. His reflection was pale, eyes wide, pupils dilated, but he was still breathing, still standing. That night he wrote in his hidden journal, "No pain, no death, only change." Over the next few days he took more, carefully measured droplets. First 1, then 2, then 5, mixed with honey, with herbal tea, with wine, always cold, always burning. What followed, to him, was a breakthrough. He claimed he could see more clearly, sleep more deeply, and wake with a sharper mind. His hands, once trembling from fever, now stilled. His breath felt longer. His heartbeat is slower, yet stronger. Whether this was real or a delusion didn't matter. He believed it. And belief, in his world, was everything. He began recording everything obsessively. Dozens of black leather books filled with notes, pulse rates, body temperature, changes in taste, patterns in dreams. He drew complex diagrams of energy flow through the human form. He believed the mercury was altering him, not just physically, but spiritually. He stopped speaking to his attendants and scribes. He spoke only to his instructors, the outcast alchemists who fed his ambition with stories of Eastern immortals and mythical elixirs. He stopped attending imperial dinners altogether, but not everyone was convinced. Though he kept his transformation hidden, small signs began to slip through the cracks. Silver streaks marked his drinking vessels. His lips sometimes glittered unnaturally. A servant noticed blood in his handkerchief. Another claimed the prince left behind faint chemical burns where he rested his fingers too long. Still, the prince dismissed these signs. To him, they were proof that the old shell was breaking, that something stronger was being born beneath the surface. He doubled the dose, and soon the mercury wasn't just changing how he felt, it was changing how he was seen. His eyes began to redden. His skin took on a gray tint. He stopped smiling, stopped blinking as often. His words, when spoken, were cryptic and slow, as if spoken by someone translating thought into a foreign language. The court noticed, and quietly, behind closed doors, they began to worry. Because whatever the prince believed he was becoming, they feared he might already be something else entirely. At first, the signs could be ignored, dismissed as eccentricity, as the latest in a long line of royal oddities. But soon, the whispers inside the Habsburg court grew sharper, colder. Something was wrong with the prince. The change had been slow, but unmistakable. His once fragile voice, soft and uncertain, now echoed with strange inflection. Deliberate, slow, as though measured against a metronome only he could hear. His skin, once pale from illness, now looked ashen, with a faint metallic sheen. His lips had taken on a bluish tint. A maid swore she saw one of his fingernails fall off during dinner preparation, and he didn't flinch. He rarely left his private wing now, and when he did, he walked stiffly, like his limbs were heavier. Servants assigned to his chambers reported a sickly chemical smell clinging to his robes and bed linens. A court herbalist, secretly called in to inspect the air, claimed the scent was familiar, mercury vapor mixed with sulfur and alcohol. The emperor was alerted, but by now the prince was no longer entertaining counsel, not from physicians, not from priests. He had taken to writing in strange symbols and keeping his windows shuttered at all times. Light, he claimed, interfered with the transference of what no one knew. His personal guard reported that he'd covered the walls with alchemical glyphs, circles within circles, etched with red ink and something else they couldn't identify. The court was no longer merely concerned, they were afraid. Ministers began holding secret meetings. Should he be isolated, removed, replaced? But the imperial name carried weight, even when diseased. The church was hesitant to intervene, so they waited and watched, until a moment came that could not be ignored. One morning, a chamber servant assigned to bring the prince his bathwater found him standing barefoot in the center of the room. Surrounded by broken glass and open flasks, his chest was bare, his skin was blistered and silver-stained. He stared at her, unblinking. She dropped the pitcher and fled. From that day, the court stopped pretending this was an illness. Something darker had taken root, and yet no one dared act, because every attempt to reach him failed. Every advisor was turned away. Every door was locked. The prince had begun sealing himself off, not just from the world, but from his own humanity. And those who watched from a distance wondered, if no one could reach him, who or what could? The palace no longer held a prince, it held a laboratory. After the servants' terrified encounter, the court largely withdrew. They posted guards near his wing, not to protect him, but to protect others. Priests sent to intervene were turned away at the door. Royal physicians were denied entry, no more confessions, no more mass. The prince had chosen a new congregation. Inside his sealed chambers, he surrounded himself with a strange and unsettling failed physicians, wandering mystics and disgraced alchemists, many of whom had been exiled from universities or quietly removed from noble households. They spoke in riddles and quoted books banned by the church. Together, they called themselves the Circle of the Veil. They no longer treated the prince's condition as an illness. They treated it as a transmutation, a process, a sacred ordeal. They believed he was becoming more than a man, more of a vessel for something eternal, forged through metal, fire, and suffering. Every night the wing flickered with candlelight. Bottles clinked, strange fumes wafted into the hall. Servants tasked with delivering food were forbidden to speak. Some returned trembling, others requested reassignment. In this cloistered world, the prince became both leader and experiment. His body was not his own, it was a crucible. Mercury was mixed with wine, ash, and powdered gold. He would bathe in it, inhale it, ingest it. Each ritual was more elaborate than the last. Days were structured around symbolic timings, solstices, moon cycles, planetary alignments. He wore amethyst rings and copper wires, claiming they guided the current, and he kept writing. Dozens of new notebooks emerged, filled with strange combinations of languages, Latin, Hebrew, and sigils pulled from forbidden manuscripts. He claimed he had dreams in which he left his body, floating above a sea of glass, speaking to beings made of light and metal. He believed these visions were real, that his transformation was being guided by something ancient. The prince was no longer curious about Mercury, he was devoted to it. And those around him believed it was working. His hair was falling out, his skin glowed faintly under candlelight. He no longer needed sleep. He claimed only moments of stillness. But not all was progress. Something else was beginning to happen, something he didn't write down, couldn't explain. It started with tremors. Then came the twitching jaw, the blackened fingernails, the sudden bursts of rage. His mind was sharp, too sharp, and yet splintering. He said it was part of the alchemical rebirth. But those watching from the shadows knew better. His body was losing the war. The transformation the prince dreamed of was no longer spiritual, it was visceral. His once frail, pale body now twitched uncontrollably, fingers curled inward like talons. His speech, once slow and deliberate, had become fractured, laced with gibberish and ancient phrases no one could trace. He would convulse during meals, blood would drip from his nose, and still, he insisted it was progress. "The vessel must break before the light enters," he whispered. Court officials began compiling reports in secret. They recorded each symptom: the tremors, memory loss, blackened gums, and hallucinations. His notebooks had grown unreadable, filled with sprawling sigils, spirals, and sketches of impossible creatures with glowing eyes and silver skin. He stopped recognizing familiar faces, and yet, he smiled more often. To his followers, he was becoming something divine. To the rest of the palace, he was clearly dying. But no one could reach him. His chambers remained locked, his mind unreachable, and the circle of the veil, they called his suffering the shedding. But behind the walls of power and ritual, one thing had become terrifyingly clear. The prince was unraveling, and the emperor was about to step in. The silence could not continue. Whispers of the prince's collapse had reached the emperor's private chambers. Courtiers urged him to act. Physicians begged. Even the archbishop warned that whatever was happening behind those locked doors had gone too far. And so, under the weight of duty and legacy, the emperor came. He entered the West Wing unannounced, flanked by guards and the court physician. What they found was not a prince, but a figure hunched beneath black drapery, surrounded by open flasks, melted candles, and chalk drawings on every surface. The air stung with the scent of metal and mold. The emperor called his name. The figure turned slowly. His skin was cracked and peeling. His hair clung to his skull in strands. His eyes were bloodshot and burning. "What have you done?" the emperor said. The confrontation grew tense. The prince raved about purification, about angels made of mercury, about the deathless plane he was almost ready to enter. He swore he was close, just days away. But the emperor had heard enough. That night, the prince was declared unfit. Access to his laboratory was restricted. Alchemists were expelled, guards posted. But the prince did not resist. He returned to his ritual chamber smiling, because in his mind, the final stage had already begun. Weeks after the emperor's intervention, the palace was calm, but beneath the stillness, something was brewing. The prince, though isolated, had not stopped his rituals. He was seen less and less. Meals went untouched. Journals appeared outside his door, filled with cryptic declarations. Then one night something changed. A servant reported a strange glow beneath his door. Low chanting echoed through the stone halls. By morning, his room was silent. When guards entered hours later, they found him collapsed in the center of an elaborate ritual circle. Broken glass littered the floor. Bowls of thick, silvery liquid had been poured over his chest, shoulders, and face. His skin was blistered, his breath barely audible. One final entry lay on his desk, written in a shaking hand: "I have peeled the flesh from spirit. I am no longer a prince, I am a vessel." The physicians rushed in, but it was too late. He slipped into unconsciousness, never to wake again. Or so they thought, because his body didn't rot. Not for days, and some claimed they saw him breathing. His chambers were sealed, his alchemical texts vanished. The circle of the veil disappeared. Some were arrested, others were never found. His name was erased from public records, his likeness destroyed. Even in death, the prince was dangerous. The emperor forbade all inquiry. What little remained of his journals, his symbols, the chemical stains on the stone floor were all buried beneath renovation and silence. But rumors outlived bricks. A physician's apprentice kept a sketch, a servant kept a vial, and in certain occult circles across Europe, he wasn't remembered as a failure, but a beginning.